Right. Hello, everyone, again to the Tuesday edition to 5G Into the Abyss, the reading series in which I read often densely existential text that makes us wonder what and why and how we do to navigate the shifting sands of infinite darkness beneath our feet. Darkness not in a negative way, just in an unknown way, a mystery that may never have any answer except for the little shines of light that our literature and art and other questions can sort of offer as a guide into these times of clarity and lucidity, I'd say. So during the quarantine, I've continued to read writings from people who have inspired me to think about these things. So today I will continue with an ongoing 4-part series focusing on Czeslaw Milosz. Czeslaw Milosz was a Polish writer that won the Nobel Prize and also taught at UC Berkeley for a while. This book is called The Captive Mind, and it's very good. A lot of the chapters have a lot to offer, but I'm just going to read 2 chapters that follow each other that I find relevant to a lot of what's happening today. So I continue today with Czeslaw Milosz, The Captive Mind. This is chapter 3, entitled Ketman. And this is from the Vintage International book, translated by Jane Giovanko. Chapter 3, Ketman. Officially, contradictions do not exist in the minds of the citizens in the people's democracies. Nobody dares to reveal them publicly. And yet the question of how to deal with them is posed in real life. More than others, the members of the intellectual elite are aware of this problem. They solve it by becoming actors. It is hard to define the type of relationship that prevails between people in the East otherwise than as acting, with the exception that one does not perform it on a theater stage, but in the street, office, factory, meeting hall, or even the room one lives in. Such acting is a highly developed craft that places a premium upon mental alertness. Before it leaves the lips, every word must be evaluated as to its consequences. A smile that appears at the wrong moment, a glance that is not all it should be, can occasion dangerous suspicions and accusations. Even one's gestures, tone of voice, or preference for certain kinds of neckties are interpreted as signs of one's political tendencies. A visitor from the Imperium is shocked on coming to the West. In his contacts with others, beginning with porters or taxi drivers, he encounters no resistance. The people he meets are completely relaxed. They lack that internal concentration which betrays itself in a lowered head or in restlessly moving eyes. They say whatever words come to their tongues. They laugh aloud. Is it possible that human relations can be so direct? Acting in daily life differs from acting in the theater in that everyone plays to everyone else, and everyone is fully aware that this is so. The fact that a man acts is not to his prejudice. It is no proof. The fact that a man acts is not to his prejudice is no proof of unorthodoxy. But he must act well, for his ability to enter into his role skillfully proves that he has built his characterization upon an adequate foundation. If he makes a passionate speech against the West, he demonstrates that he has at least 10% of the hatred he so loudly proclaims. If he condemns Western culture lukewarmly, then he must be attached to it in reality. Of course, all human behavior contains a significant amount of acting. A man reacts to his environment and is molded by it, even in his gestures. Nevertheless, what we find in the people's democracies is a conscious mass play rather than automatic imitation. Conscious acting, if one practices it long enough, develops those traits which one uses most in one's role, just as a man who becomes a runner because he has good legs, develops his legs even more in training. After long acquaintance with his role, a man grows into it so closely that he can no longer differentiate his true self from the self he simulates, so that even the most intimate of individuals speak to each other in party slogans. To identify oneself with the role one is obliged to play brings relief and permits a relaxation of one's vigilance. Proper reflexes at the proper moment become truly automatic. This happens in literature as well. A poet writing a piece of propaganda does not confine himself to a purely rationalistic approach. Imbued with the thought that poetry ideally should be suited to recitation in chorus at a meeting, he begins by tuning himself to an appropriate pitch of collective emotion before he can release himself in words. In the theater, the actor who plays the Cid, for example, is the Cid on stage. Yet not every actor, even if he is young and well-built, can play the Cid. He must have an inborn capacity to release himself emotionally in that role. Poetry, as we have known it, can be defined as the individual temperament refracted through social convention. The poetry of the new faith can, on the contrary, be defined as social convention refracted through the individual temperament. That is why the poets who are most adapted to the new situation are those endowed with dramatic talent. The poet creates the character of an ideal revolutionary and writes his verses as the monologue of this character. He does not speak for himself, but for the ideal citizen. His results are reminiscent of songs written to be sung on the march, since the aim is the same, the forging of the fetters of collectivity that bind together an advancing column of soldiers. The best examples of such song slogans are certain verses of the German poet Bertolt Brecht, which are superior to the works of other Eastern poets because Brecht is fully conscious of the histrionic process involved. Even though the identification of the play with private thought property is carried very far, a large residue of unassimilated matter remains, which forces one to keep alert. A constant and universal masquerade creates an aura that is hard to bear, yet it grants the performer certain, not inconsiderable satisfactions. To say something is white when one thinks it is black, to smile inwardly when one is outwardly solemn, to hate when one manifests love, to know when one pretends not to know, and thus to play one's adversary for a fool, even as he is playing you for one. These actions lead one to prize one's own cunning above all else. Success in the game becomes a source of satisfaction. Simultaneously, that which we protect from prying eyes takes on a special value because it is never clearly formulated in words, and hence has the irrational charm of things purely emotional. Man takes refuge in an inner sanctuary, which is the more precious, the greater the price he pays in order to bar others from access to it. Acting on a comparable scale has not occurred often in the history of the human race. Yet, in trying to describe these new mores, we happen across a striking analogy in the Islamic civilization of the Middle East. Not only was the game played in defense of one's thoughts and feelings well known there, but indeed it was transformed into a permanent institution and graced with the name of Ketman. What is Ketman? I found its description in a book by Gobineau entitled Religions and Philosophies of Central Asia. Gobineau spent many years in Persia. From 1855 to 1858, he was a secretary in the French legation. From 1861 to 1863, he was French minister. And we cannot deny his gift for keen observation, even though we need not necessarily agree with the conclusions of this rather dangerous writer. The similarities between Ketman and the customs cultivated in the countries of the new faith are so striking that I shall permit myself to quote at length. The people of the Mussulman East believe that, quote, he who is in possession of truth must not expose his person, his relatives, or his reputation to the blindness, the folly, the perversity of those whom it has pleased God to place and maintain in error. One must therefore keep silent about one's true convictions if possible. Nevertheless, says Gobineau, there are occasions when silence no longer suffices, when it may pass as an avowal. Then one must not hesitate. Not only must one deny one's true opinion, but one is commanded to resort to all ruses in order to deceive one's adversary. One makes all the protestations of faith that can please him. One performs all the rites one recognizes to be the most vain. One falsifies one's own books. One exhausts all possible means of deceit. Thus one acquires the multiple satisfactions and merits of having placed oneself and one's relatives under cover, of having not exposed a venerable faith to the horrible contact of the infidel, and finally of having, in cheating the latter and confirming him in his error, imposed on him the shame and spiritual misery that he deserves. Ketman fills the man who practices it with pride. Thanks to it, a believer raises himself to a permanent state of superiority over the man he deceives, be he a minister of state or a powerful king. To him who uses Ketman, the other is a miserable blind man whom one shuts off from the true path whose existence he does not suspect. While you, tattered and dying of hunger, trembling externally at the feet of duped force, your eyes are filled with light. You walk in brightness before your enemies. It is an unintelligent being that you make sport of. It is a dangerous beast that you disarm. What a wealth of pleasures. How far Ketman can go is demonstrated by the founder of one sect, Hadzi Sheikh Ahmed. Although he left behind many works of theology, he never openly advanced in his books, as even his most passionate disciples avow, anything which could place the reader on the path of the ideas attributed to him today. But everyone affirms he practiced Ketman, and that in private he was extremely daring and precise in establishing order in the doctrines which bear his name today. We cannot wonder, therefore, that as a certain Persian admitted in conversation with Gobineau, there is not a single true Muslim in Persia. Not everyone was as careful as Hadzi Sheikh Ahmed. To some, Ketman was useful in the preparatory period, but when they felt themselves sufficiently strong, they proclaimed their heresy openly. Here, for example, is the description of the itinerant preachings of Sadra, the disciple of Avicenna. He too was afraid of the mullahs. To incite their distrust was inevitable, but to provide a solid basis, furnish proof for their accusations, that would have been to expose himself to endless persecutions and to compromise at the same time the future of the philosophical restoration he meditated. Therefore, he conformed to the demands of his times and resorted to the great and splendid expedient of Ketman. When he arrived in the city, he was careful to present himself humbly to all the Majutaheads or doctors of the region. He sat in a corner of their salons, their talars, remained silent usually, spoke modestly, approved each word that escaped their venerable lips. He was questioned about his knowledge. He expressed only ideas borrowed from the strictest Shiite theology and in no way indicated that he concerned himself with philosophy. After several days seeing him so meek, the Mujtahids themselves engaged him to give public lessons. He set to work immediately, took as his text the doctrine of ablution or some similar point, and split hairs over the prescriptions and inner doubts of the subtlest theoreticians. This behavior delighted the mullahs. They lauded him to the skies. They forgot to keep an eye on him. They themselves wanted to see him lead their imaginations through less placid questions. He did not refuse. From the doctrine of ablution, he passed to that of prayer. From the doctrine of prayer to that of revelation, from revelation to divine unity, and there, with marvels of ingenuity, reticence, confidences to the most advanced pupils, self-contradiction, ambiguous propositions, fallacious syllogisms, out of which only the initiated could see their way, the whole heavily seasoned with unimpeachable professions of faith, he succeeded in spreading Avicennism throughout the entire lettered class. And when at last he believed he could reveal himself completely, he drew aside the veils, repudiated Islam, and showed himself the logician, the metaphysician that he really was. Islamic Ketman and the Ketman of the 20th century in Europe seemed to differ only in that the boldness Sadra permitted himself would instantly have brought him to a sad end in Europe. Nevertheless, Ketman, in its narrowest and severest forms, is widely practiced in the people's democracies. As in Islam, the feeling of superiority over those who are unworthy of attaining truth constitutes one of the chief joys of people whose lives do not in general abound in pleasures. Deviations, the tracing of which creates so many troubles for the rulers, are not an illusion. They are cases of accidental unmaskings of Ketman. and those who are most helpful in detecting deviations are those who themselves practice a similar form of Ketman, like Mike Pompeo. Recognizing in other acrobats the tricks they themselves employ, they take advantage of the first occasion to down an opponent or friend. Thus, they protect themselves, and the measure of dexterity is to anticipate by at least one day the similar accusation which could be leveled against them by the man they denounce. Since the number of varieties of Ketman is practically unlimited, the naming of deviations cannot keep pace with the weeding of a garden so full of unexpected specimens of heresy. Every new commentary on the precepts of the new faith proclaimed by the center multiplies the internal reservations of those who are externally the most faithful. It is impossible to enumerate all the forms of Ketman that one can discover in the people's democracies. I shall try, however, to proceed somewhat in the manner of a naturalist determining major groups and families. National Ketman is broadly diffused throughout the masses, and even the upper brackets of the party in the various dependent states are not free of it, because Tito, like Sadra, announced his heresy to all the world. Millions of human beings in the people's democracies must employ exceedingly ingenious means of masking themselves. Instructive displays of condemnation of those who wish to follow the national road to socialism in individual Eastern capitals taught the public what kind of phrases and reflexes can expose one to reproach for harboring this fatal tendency. The surest safeguard is to manifest loudly one's awe at Russia's achievements in every field of endeavor, to carry Russian books under one's arm, to hum Russian songs, to applaud Russian actors and musicians enthusiastically, etc. A writer who has not consecrated a single work to outstanding Russian figures or to Russian life, but has confined himself to national themes, cannot consider himself entirely safe. The chief characteristic of the people who practice this Ketman is an unbounded contempt for Russia as a barbaric country. Among the workers and peasants, it is most often purely emotional and based on observation of either the soldiers of a liberating army or, since during the war, a great many were in areas directly administered by the Russians, of Russians in their daily life. But until now, the living standard of the masses in Russia was so much lower than that of the so-called people's democracies, national Ketman finds abundant nourishment. It cannot be defined simply as nationalism. For many centuries, hatred existed between the Central European Slavs and the Germans. Still, it was colored among the Slavs by a respect for Germany's material achievements. On the other hand, perceiving by comparison the greater refinement of his own customs, his greater organizational ability, be it only in respect to transportation or the handling of machinery, the Central European would express his attitude toward Russia, if he could, by a disdainful shrug of his shoulders, which, however, doesn't prevent him from shuddering in fear before the countless hordes pouring out of the Euro-Asian continent. But this Ketman is not exclusively emotional in its appeal. Amid the young intelligentsia of working class origin, the overwhelming opinion can be summed up shortly as socialism, yes, Russia, no. And this is where the subtleties of doctrinal differences arise. The countries of Europe, this line of reasoning begins, are infinitely more prepared to realize socialism than Russia. Their population is more intelligent. Most of their land is under cultivation. Their systems of communication and their industry are more highly developed. Measures based on absolute cruelty are unnecessary and even pointless, since there exists a greater degree of social discipline. Nevertheless, the national road to socialism has been condemned, and many efforts made to prove that whoever is opposed to total adaptation to Russian models and to surrendering to Russian dictatorship is a traitor who must share the fate of Tito. That is, must come out against the center and thus weaken its war potential, without which there can be no revolution on a world scale. To pronounce oneself against this thesis would be to deny the new faith and to introduce in its place a different faith, for example, one directly linked to Marx and Engels. Many do so. Others, seen in the alliance between Tito and the West, an example of historical fatality, and rejecting the idea that this fatality may be due simply to the center's policy toward dependent nations, shut themselves up in a Ketman which does not hamper the center in its external acts. A true Muslim, even though he be deeply attached to his Ketman, never seeks to injure Islam in those areas where it is fighting for its life against unbelievers. Such Ketman expresses itself only in practical moves which do no harm in the world's struggle, but which, on the other hand, safeguard national interest wherever possible. The Ketman of revolutionary purity is a rare variety, more common in the large cities of Russia than in the people's democracies. It is based on a belief in the sacred fire of the revolutionary epoch of Lenin, which burns in such a poet as Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky's suicide in 1930 marked the end of an era distinguished by the flowering of literature, the theater, and music. The sacred fire was dampened. Collectivization was introduced mercilessly. Millions of Soviet citizens perished in slave labor camps. A ruthless policy toward non-Russian nations was established. Literature became flat and colorless under the influence of imposed theories. Russian painting was destroyed. Russian theater, then the foremost in the world, was deprived of freedom to experiment. Science was subjected to directives from party chiefs. A man who reasons thus hates him with all his heart, holding him responsible for the terrible lot of the Russian people and for the hatred they inspire in other nations. Still, he is not altogether sure whether he is necessary or not. Perhaps in extraordinary periods such as the present, the appearance of a tyrant must be considered desirable. Mass purges in which so many good communists died, the lowering of the living standard of the citizens, the reduction of artists and scholars to the status of yes men, the extermination of entire national groups. What other man would dare undertake such measures? After all, Russia stood firm against Hitler. The revolution weathered the attack of enemy armies. In this perspective, his acts seem effective and even justified, perhaps by an exceptional historical situation. If he had not instituted an exceptional terror in the year 1937, wouldn't there have been more people willing to help Hitler than there actually were? For example, doesn't the present-day line in scholarship and art, no matter how at odds it may be at times with common sense, effectually raise Russian morale in the face of the war that threatens? He is an infamous blot on the bright new faith, but a blemish we must tolerate for the moment. And indeed, we must even support him. The sacred fire has not gone out. When victory is achieved, it will burst forth again with its old strength. The bonds he imposed will fall away, and relations between nations will operate on new and better principles. This variety of Ketman was widespread, if not universal, in Russia during the Second World War, and its present form is a rebirth of an already once deceived hope. Aesthetic Ketman is born of the disparity between man's longings and the sense satisfactions the new faith offers. A man of taste cannot approve the results of official pressure in the realm of culture, no matter how much he applauds the latest verses, how many flattering reviews he writes of current art expositions, nor how studiously he pretends that the gloomy new buildings coincide with his personal preferences in architecture. He changes completely within the four walls of his home. There, one finds, if he is a well-situated intellectual, reproductions of works of art officially condemned as bourgeois, records of modern music, and a rich collection of ancient authors in various languages. This luxury of splendid isolation is pardoned him so long as his creative work is effective propaganda. To protect his position and his apartment, which he has by the grace of the state, the intellectual is prepared to make any sacrifice or compromise. For the value of privacy in a society that affords little, if any isolation, is greater than the saying, "My home is my castle," can lead one to surmise. Two-way television screens installed in private homes to observe the behavior of citizens in seclusion belongs as yet to the future. Hence, by listening to foreign radio stations and reading good books, he profits from a moment of relaxation. That is, of course, if he is alone, for as soon as guests arrive, the play begins anew. Never has there been a close study of how necessary to a man are the experiences which we clumsily call aesthetic. Such experiences are associated with works of art for only an insignificant number of individuals. The majority find pleasure of an aesthetic nature in the mere fact of their existence within the stream of life. In the cities, the eye meets colorful store displays, the diversity of human types. Looking at passers-by, one can guess from their faces the story of their lives. This movement of the imagination when a man is walking through a crowd has an erotic tinge. His emotions are very close to physiological sensations. He rejoices in dresses and the flash of lights, while, for instance, Parisian markets with their heaps of vegetables and flowers, fish of every shape and hue, fruits, sides of meat dripping with every shade of red, offer delights. He need not go seeking them in Dutch or Impressionist paintings. He hears snatches of arias, the throbbing of motors mixed with the warble of birds called greetings, laughter. His nose is assailed by changing odors, coffee, gasoline, oranges, ozone, roasting nuts, perfumes. Those who have sung of the large cities have consecrated many pages to the description of this joyous immersion in the reservoir of universal life. The swimmer who trusts himself to the wave and senses the immensity of the element that surrounds him lives through a like emotion. I am thinking of such great singers of the city as Balzac, Baudelaire, and Whitman. It would seem that the exciting and invigorating power of this participation in mass life springs from the feeling of potentiality, of constant unexpectedness, of a mystery one ever pursues. Even the life of the peasants, though it be dulled by brutalizing hand labor, allows for aesthetic expression in the rhythm of custom, the rites of the church, holy pictures, country fairs, native costumes, paper flower decorations, folk sculptures, music, and dances. In the countries of the new faith, the cities lose their former aspect. The liquidation of small private enterprises gives the street a stiff and institutional look. The chronic lack of consumer goods renders the crowds uniformly gray and uniformly indigent. When consumer products do appear, they are of a single second-rate quality. Fear paralyzes individuality and makes people adjust themselves as much as possible to the average type in their gestures, clothing, and facial expressions. Cities become filled with the racial type well regarded by the rulers, short, square men and women with short legs and wide hips. This is the proletarian type cultivated to an extreme thanks to binding aesthetic standards. We know that these same dumpy women and stocky men could change completely under the influence of films, painting, and fashion, for America has proved that mass communication is at least as important as diet in determining physical appearance. Streets, factories, and meeting places sport the inevitable red flags and painted slogans. The new buildings are monumental and oppressive, lightness and charm in architecture being condemned as formalistic. The number of aesthetic experiences accessible to a city dweller in the countries of the new faith is uncommonly limited. The only place of magic is the theater, for the spell of the theater exists even though confined by the commands of socialist realism, which define both the contents of a play and stage decor. The tremendous popular success of authors like Shakespeare is due to the fact that their fantasy triumphs even within the bounds of naturalistic stage setting. The hunger for strangeness that is so great inside the Imperium should give the rulers pause. Yet, in all probability, it does not, for they consider such longings derelicts from the past. In the villages where the entire former pattern of custom is to be abolished through the transformation of peasants into agricultural workers, there still remain survivals of the individual peasant cultures which slowly stratified over the centuries. Still, let us speak frankly, the main supports of this culture were usually the wealthier peasants. The battle against them and their subsequent need to hide must lead to the atrophy of peasant dress, decoration of huts, cultivation of private gardens, etc. There is a definite contradiction between the official protection of folklore as a harmless form of national culture designed to satisfy patriotic tendencies and the necessities of the new economic structure. In these conditions, aesthetic Ketman has every possibility of spreading. It is expressed not only in that unconscious longing for strangeness, which is channeled toward controlled amusements like theater, film, and folk festivals, but also into various forms of escapism. Writers burrow into ancient texts, comment upon and re-edit ancient authors. They write children's books so that their fancy might have slightly freer play. Many choose university careers because research into literary history offers a safe pretext for plunging into the past and for converse with works of great aesthetic value. The number of translators of former prose and poetry multiplies. Painters seek an outlet for their interest in illustrations for children's books. where the choice of gaudy colors can be justified by an appeal to the naive imagination of children. Stage managers doing their duty by presenting bad contemporary works endeavor to introduce into their repertoires the plays of Lope de Vega or Shakespeare, that is, those of their plays which are approved by the center. Some representatives of the plastic arts are so daring that they reveal their Ketman to no small degree by proclaiming the need of an aesthetic of everyday life and by establishing special institutes to design fabrics, furniture, glass, and ceramics for industry. There is money for such enterprises, and they find support among the most intelligent dialecticians of the upper circles of the party. Such efforts deserve respect when one considers that before the Second World War, Poland and Czechoslovakia were, aside from Sweden and Finland, the leading countries in interior decoration. Nevertheless, there is no reason why that which passes as formalism in painting and architecture should be tolerated for any length in time in the applied arts. The rationalization of aesthetic Ketman is obvious. Since everything is planned in a socialist country, in a socialist economy, why not proceed to a planned satisfaction of the aesthetic needs of human beings? Here, however, we trespass upon the treacherous territory of the demon, psychology. To admit that a man's eye has need of exultant colors, harmonious forms, or light sunny architecture is to affirm that the taste of the center is bad. However, even there, one can see some progress. They are already erecting skyscrapers patterned after the buildings raised in Chicago about the year 1900. It is possible that in the year 2000, they will officially introduce art forms that today are considered modern in the West. But how can one still the thought that aesthetic experiences arise out of something organic, and that the union of color and harmony with fear is as difficult to imagine as brilliant plumage on birds living in the northern tundras? Professional Ketman is reasoned thus. Since I find myself in circumstances over which I have no control, and since I have but one life, and that is fleeting, I should strive to do my best. I am like a crustacean attached to a crag on the bottom of the sea. Over me storms rage and huge ships sail, but my entire effort is concentrated upon clinging to the rock, for otherwise I will be carried off by the waters and perish, leaving no trace behind. If I am a scientist, I attend congresses in which I deliver reports strictly adhering to the party line. But in a laboratory, I pursue my research according to scientific methods, and in that alone lies the aim of life. If my work is successful, it matters little how it will be presented and toward whose glory. Discoveries made in the name of a disinterested search for truth are lasting, whereas the shrieks of politicians pass. I must do all they demand. They may use my name as they wish, as long as I have access to a laboratory and money for the purchase of scientific instruments. If I am a writer, I take pride in my literary achievements. Here, for example, is my treatise on Swift, a Marxist analysis. This type of analysis, which is not synonymous with the method or the new faith, makes possible a keen penetration into historical events. Marx had a genius for observation. In following him, one is secure against attack, for he is, after all, the prophet. And one can proclaim one's belief in the method and the new faith in a preface fulfilling much the same function as dedications to kings or tsars in times past. Here's my translation of a 16th century poem, or my novel, whose scene is laid in the distant past. Aren't they of permanent value? Here are my translations from Russian. They are viewed with much approbation and have brought me a large sum of money, but certainly Pushkin is a great poet, and his worth is not altered by the fact that today his poems serve him as a means of propaganda. Obviously, I must pay for the right to practice my profession with a certain number of articles and odes in the way of tribute. Still, one's life on earth is not judged by transitory panegyrics written out of necessity. These two examples of professional Ketman should demonstrate how little discomfort it creates for the rulers. It is the source of considerable dynamic force and one cause of the tremendous impetus towards education. The object is to establish some special field in which one can release one's energies, exploit one's knowledge and sensibility, and at the same time escape the fate of a functionary entirely at the mercy of political fluctuations. The son of a worker who becomes a chemist makes a permanent advance. The son of a worker who becomes a member of the security police rises to the surface where large ships sail, but where the sea is changeable and stormy. But most important of all, chemical experiments, bridges, translations of poetry, and medical care are exceptionally free of falsity. The state, in its turn, takes advantage of this Ketman because it needs chemists, engineers, and doctors. From time to time, it is true, there comes from above muffled grumbles of hatred against those who practice Ketman in the realm of humanistic studies. Fadyev, Moscow's literary overseer, attacked the University of Leningrad because one of its students had written a dissertation on the English poet Walter Savage Landor. Who needs Landor? Who ever heard of him? Cried Fadyev. So it would seem that moderation and watchfulness are indicated for those who espouse this form of Ketman. Skeptical Ketman is widely disseminated throughout intellectual circles. One argues that humanity does not know how to handle its knowledge or how to resolve the problems of production and division of goods. The first scientific attempts to solve social problems made in the 19th century are interesting but not precise enough. They happened, however, into the hands of the Russians who, unable to think otherwise than dogmatically, raised these first attempts to the dignity of dogma. What is happening in Russia and the countries dependent upon her bespeaks a kind of insanity, but it is not impossible that Russia will manage to impose her insanity upon the whole world and that the return to reason will occur only after 200 or 300 years. Finding oneself in the very midst of an historical cyclone, one must behave as prudently as possible, yielding externally to forces capable of destroying all adversaries. This does not prevent one from taking pleasure in one's observations, since what one beholds is indeed unprecedented. Surely man has never before been subjected to such pressure. Never has he had to writhe and wriggle so to adapt himself to forms constructed according to the books, but obviously not to his size. All his intellectual and emotional capacities are put to the test. Whoever contemplates this daily sight of repudiation and humiliation knows more about man than an inhabitant of the West who feels no pressure other than that of money. The accumulating of this store of observations is the activity of a miser who counts his treasure in secret. Since this Ketman is based on a total lack of belief in the method, it helps one conform externally to the obligatory line by allowing for complete cynicism and therefore for elasticity in adjusting oneself to changing tactics. I am going to stop here. There are still a few more examples of this Ketman. I find it very interesting. The next one is metaphysical Ketman. I see a lot of very interesting comparisons to a totalitarian state and the amount of pressure and restriction to the kind of content that we are introduced to and have access to in our highly commercialized and very financially unstable practices where you are dependent on receiving funding, and how you get the funding is either based on applying for a grant and approval or having the public support, ticket sales and whatnot. So if we wonder about the things that are available to us and how we might find them gray, you could consider a Marvel movie gray if you wanted to. Anyway, good to talk to you all. It's a pleasure. And tomorrow we'll finish Czeslaw Milosz. And after that, I'll bring in some probably at least a little bit of humor. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.